a bounty hunter, a silent boy, and a woman who refused to back down. When she chose to protect them, she didn't just risk her life. She declared war against powerful men who owned the land. This story teaches us, sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to protect what truly matters. This channel is dedicated to Western stories, cowboy lives, frontier love, motherhood, and the quiet kindness that survives even in brutal worlds. If you enjoy stories like this, hit like, comment your thoughts, share it, and subscribe for more. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
The Wyoming wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore at the pine-shingled roof of Emmeline Hayes's cabin like a starving wolf trying to get at the marrow inside. But it wasn't the howling wind that pulled Emma from her restless sleep. It was a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a frantic, high-pitched whinny. Emma's eyes snapped open in the pitch black. Survival on Whisper Ridge didn't afford the luxury of hesitation, nor did it tolerate the weak. Before her bare feet even hit the freezing floorboards, her calloused fingers had already found the cold steel of the Winchester 73 leaning against her nightstand. She didn't bother lighting a lantern. Light made you a target. Moving with the silent grace of a woman who had spent the last 2 years defending her father's land alone, she slipped her heavy wool shawl over her nightgown and cocked the lever of the rifle. The metallic clack-clack was the only comfort she needed. She pressed her back against the wall beside the heavy oak door. "Who's out there?" she shouted, her voice sharp and steady, cutting through the roar of the blizzard. Silence, save for the wind. Then a heavy thud against the base of her door, followed by a ragged, wet gasp. Emma unlatched the deadbolt and kicked the door open, stepping back with the rifle raised to her shoulder. The storm burst into the room, bringing a cloud of blinding white snow and biting cold. When the flurries settled, she lowered the barrel an inch. At the bottom of her porch steps stood a massive black gelding, its coat matted with ice, head bowed in pure exhaustion. And sprawled across her frozen threshold was the dark shape of a man. Even in the pale, eerie light of the moon filtering through the snow, Emma could see the trail he had left. A thick, dark smear dragged all the way from the tree line to her boots. Blood, too much of it. "I'm armed," Emma warned, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "State your business." The man didn't look up. He was on his knees, his heavy canvas duster stiff with ice. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. Instead, his large, gloved hands were fiercely protective of a bundle clutched to his chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the man raised his head. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed Stetson, but Emma saw the hard, sharp line of his jaw and the deadly exhaustion in his stance. He didn't look like a man asking for charity. He looked like a man who had fought the devil and barely walked away. "Take him," the man rasped. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape, empty of any plea for his own life. "The horse is yours, the saddle too. Just take the boy." Emma's gaze dropped. The bundle in his arms shifted. A small face emerged from beneath a thick wool blanket. A little boy no older than 7, his lips blue, his eyes wide and terrified. Emma swallowed hard. The iron wall she had built around her heart since her father's death cracked just a fraction. "Damn it." "Nobody is dying on my porch," Emma snapped, stepping forward. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and grabbed the man by the collar of his coat. "Get up. Come on, get on your feet." He groaned, the sound tearing from deep within his chest, but he forced his legs to obey. Emma dragged him and the boy across the threshold, slamming the heavy door shut behind them and throwing the bolt. The sudden quiet of the cabin was deafening. The man collapsed immediately onto the braided rug in front of the dying hearth, his grip on the boy finally loosening. "Start the fire," Emma ordered the heir, rushing to the kitchen counter to strike a match and light the kerosene lamp. Golden light flooded the small room. Emma knelt beside the strangers. She gently pulled the boy away from the man. The child was freezing, shivering violently, but when Emma looked into his eyes, he didn't make a single sound. Not a cry, not a whimper. He just stared at her with a haunting, profound silence. "You're safe now," she murmured, wrapping him tightly in her warmest quilt and pushing him closer to the reviving fire. She turned her attention to the man. He was unconscious, breathing in shallow, ragged hitches. Emma grabbed her shears and cut away the thick, blood-soaked layers of his coat and flannel shirt. When she exposed his left shoulder, she hissed through her teeth. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a bear mauling or a fall from a horse. It was a bullet wound. The lead had gouged a deep, ugly trench straight across his collarbone. Whoever this man was, he was being hunted. Emma's survival instincts flared. She needed to disarm him before he woke up. She reached for the heavy leather gun belt strapped low across his hips. As she unbuckled it and pulled the revolver from its holster, she paused, her thumb tracing the metal. She knew guns. Her father had taught her well. This wasn't a cheap, rusty six-shooter carried by a common drifter or a desperate rustler. It was a custom Colt single-action army. The action was butter smooth, the barrel immaculately oiled, the grip worn down perfectly to fit a specific hand. It was the weapon of a professional, a dangerous, lethal man. Emma stood up slowly, holding the heavy Colt. She looked down at the bleeding stranger, then at the silent, traumatized boy watching her from the hearth. She had just locked her door against the deadly Wyoming blizzard, but as she stared at the man on her floor, Emma realized the true storm had just been invited inside. She set his revolver on the high mantel, out of reach, and grabbed her medical kit. It was going to be a long night. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a dull gray crawl that barely pierced the frosted window panes. Outside, the blizzard was a blinding wall of white, burying the Whisper Ridge Trail under drifts deep enough to swallow a wagon whole. Inside the cabin, the heavy scent of chicory coffee and bacon grease hung in the air. Silas Vance clawed his way back to consciousness through a haze of dull, throbbing pain. His first instinct, honed by years of sleeping with one eye open, was to reach for the familiar weight at his hip. His hand found empty canvas. The Colt was gone. His gray eyes snapped open, heart hammering against his ribs. He gritted his teeth, forcing down a groan as a sharp fire flared across his left collarbone. He was lying on a makeshift pallet near the potbelly stove, his shoulder tightly bound in clean white linen that smelled of witch hazel and carbolic soap. "Looking for this?" The voice was cool, steady, and cut through the crackle of the fire. Silas turned his head. Sitting at the small, scarred wooden table across the room was the woman. She had a tin cup of coffee in one hand. Resting casually across her lap, its muzzle pointed safely away but easily maneuverable, was his custom single-action army revolver. Her own Winchester rifle leaned against the chair beside her. She wasn't a fragile prairie flower. In the harsh morning light, Silas took her in. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy, no-nonsense braid. She wore a faded flannel shirt tucked into men's denim work pants, and her hands wrapped around the tin cup were rough and calloused. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were a striking, piercing hazel, carrying the wary intelligence of a lone wolf. Before Silas could answer, a small movement caught his eye. Caleb. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the braided rug a few feet away, cocooned in a thick quilt. He was staring quietly at the flames, a half-eaten buttermilk biscuit in his small hands. He looked up when he heard Silas move, his blue eyes wide, but he made no sound. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The boy was alive. "He hasn't spoken a word since he woke up," the woman said, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "Hasn't cried either. Just watches." "He doesn't talk much," Silas rasped. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. He shifted, trying to sit up against the log wall, his jaw locking tight against the pane. "Much obliged to you, ma'am, for the patching up." I pulled a splinter of lead out of your shoulder. Bullet grazed you clean, but it bled like a slaughtered pig, she stated factually, her gaze never wavering. You brought trouble to my door, mister. I just need to know if that trouble is riding up the ridge behind you. Not in this storm, Silas said, his voice flat. He looked toward the frosted window. The wind was still shrieking. Nobody's tracking through that, not even the devil himself. Good. She set her cup down. Because I don't have the ammunition to fight off a posse, and I don't intend to die for a stranger. Once the snow stops and the trail clears, you take your horse and your boy and you ride on. Silas nodded slowly. That's fair. We just need to wait out the whiteout. He swallowed hard. I told you last night, you can keep the black gelding. And the saddle. It's all the payment I've got. The woman studied him for a long, quiet moment. She saw the way he favored his left side, the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face, and the protective, almost desperate way he kept glancing at the boy. I don't want your horse, she finally said. Silas frowned. Then what do you want? I want to survive the winter, she replied, her tone turning purely pragmatic. She stood up, tall and unyielding in her own domain. Since my father passed, I've run this homestead alone. The firewood is getting low. The barn roof is sagging under the snow, and I've got livestock that needs tending before they freeze to death. A woman with 2 arms can do a lot, but she can't be in 2 places at once. She walked over to a heavy iron-bound cedar chest sitting at the foot of her bed. She opened it, dropped his Colt inside, and turned the heavy brass key, slipping it into her pocket. Silas tensed. A man needs his iron out here. A man who brings bullet wounds into my house doesn't get to carry iron under my roof, she countered, her voice leaving no room for argument. Here is the deal. You and the boy stay until the spring thaw. You get a warm fire, a dry roof, and 3 hot meals a day. In exchange, you lend me your good arm. You chop the wood, you mend the fences, and you help me keep this place standing. Silas stared at her. It was a hard bargain, but a fair one. More than fair, considering he was a wanted man with a bounty on his head, and she could have easily let him bleed out on the porch. He looked at Caleb, who was shivering slightly despite the quilt, clutching the biscuit like a lifeline. Running now would kill the boy. You drive a hard bargain, lady, Silas said, the ghost of a wry, bitter smile touching the corner of his mouth. The ridge doesn't negotiate, she replied evenly. Neither do I. Do we have a pact? Silas pushed himself up a little higher against the wall, extending his right hand toward her. Silas, he said, offering his name as the first piece of collateral. Silas Vance. And the boy is Caleb. She looked at his large, rough hand for a second before stepping forward and gripping it firmly. Her handshake was surprisingly strong. Emmeline Hayes, she said. Most folks call me Emma. Now, if you're done bleeding all over my floor, Mr. Vance, the coffee is hot and the barn needs mucking. For 3 days, the blizzard battered Whisper Ridge, burying the cabin under snowdrifts as high as the windowsills. On the 4th morning, the wind finally broke, leaving behind a world of blinding silent white, and the rhythmic, punishing thwack of an axe. Emma stood at the frost-rimmed kitchen window, a steaming mug of chicory coffee warming her palms. Outside in the biting cold, Silas Vance was splitting firewood. He had discarded his heavy canvas duster, working only in his flannel shirt and a sheepskin vest. His breath plumed like chimney smoke in the freezing air. He was favoring his left arm, his movements stiff and deliberate. But the swing of his right arm was devastatingly precise. The heavy iron maul came down, splitting the thick pine logs with a single violent crack. Thwack! Emma watched the flex of his shoulders beneath the flannel. The man was running on pure, stubborn grit. The bullet wound was barely scabbed over, yet he had been out there since dawn, building a woodpile high enough to see them through February. He hadn't complained. He hadn't asked for a break. He just worked with the grim determination of a man paying off a debt. He's going to tear those stitches, Emma thought, her brow furrowing. She grabbed her shawl and pushed the heavy oak door open, the crisp air stinging her lungs. "Vance!" she called out from the porch. Silas paused, the axe resting on the chopping block. He looked up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather glove. "Ma'am?" "You keep swinging like that, you're going to bust that shoulder wide open," she said, stepping down into the snow. "And I don't intend on spending my morning stitching you back up. The woodpile is high enough for today." Silas glanced at the mountain of split pine, then back to her. "We made a deal, Emma. I pull my weight." "Your weight is fine. Your bleeding to death in my yard isn't part of the bargain," she retorted. "Put the axe down and go check the barn roof. The snow's heavy on the east side." A faint ghost of an amused smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. He didn't argue. He drove the axe head deep into the stump and tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am." As Silas headed for the ladder on the side of the barn, Emma turned her attention to the chicken coop. When she opened the creaking wooden door, she realized she wasn't alone. Sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner of the dim, hay-scented shed was Caleb. The boy had wrapped himself in his thick wool coat, his knees pulled to his chest. He was watching a fat Rhode Island red hen peck at the frozen dirt. Emma didn't startle him. She simply picked up her wicker basket and began checking the nesting boxes. "Hens get lazy when it's this cold," Emma said quietly, not demanding his attention. She found 2 brown eggs and placed them gently in the basket. "You have to look under the fresh straw. They hide them deep to keep the frost off." Caleb didn't speak, but his bright blue eyes tracked her every movement. Emma moved to the next box, brushing the hay aside. "You want to try?" she asked, holding her hand out. The boy hesitated. He looked toward the barn doors where the faint sound of his father's boots could be heard on the roof, then back to Emma. Slowly, carefully, Caleb slid off the bucket. He stepped forward, his small, pale hand reaching into the straw. He pulled out a warm, speckled egg, cradling it as if it were made of glass. "Put it in the basket," Emma instructed softly. He did. "Good job, Caleb." The boy looked up at her, and for a fleeting second, the deep-shadowed fear in his eyes lifted. It wasn't a smile, but it was trust. Emma felt a strange, fierce ache in her chest. Whoever had silenced this child was going to answer to a higher power someday. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted again. Inside the cabin, the cast-iron stove radiated a fierce, welcoming heat. The 3 of them moved around the small space in a quiet, practiced dance that felt surprisingly natural. Silas had finished his repairs and was now sitting by the fire, whittling a small block of cedar with a pocket knife for Caleb. The boy sat at his father's feet, watching the wood shavings curl onto the rug. Emma was at the stove, pulling a heavy cast-iron skillet of cornbread from the oven. She used a thick rag, but the pan was off balance, heavy with bacon grease and hot iron. It slipped. Before it could crash to the floor, a large, calloused hand shot out, grabbing the searing iron handle directly above the rag. Emma gasped, her head snapping up. Silas was right there, standing so close she could smell the scent of pine, cold air, and lye soap on his skin. He easily leveled the heavy skillet, guiding it safely onto the trivet on the table. "Careful," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. His fingers, rough and scarred from years of violence, brushed against hers. The contrast was startling, the lethal speed of his reflexes against the sudden, gentle warmth of his touch. Emma looked up into his gray eyes. They weren't cold anymore. In the dim lantern light, they were dark, intense, and searching. For a second, the rest of the world, the blizzard, the debt, the bullet wound, vanished. It was just the 2 of them, standing inches apart in the quiet warmth of the kitchen. Silas slowly stepped back, breaking the spell, though his gaze lingered on her face a second longer than necessary. He cleared his throat, looking down at his hand. "Food smells good." "It's ready," Emma said, her voice slightly breathless, suddenly acutely aware of how small the cabin really was. As they sat down to eat, Emma watched Silas cut a piece of cornbread and place it on Caleb's tin plate before serving himself. She had taken his gun and she had seen his scars. He was a dangerous man, a man running from a dark past. But as the wind howled harmlessly against the thick log walls, Emma realized the terrifying truth. The danger wasn't outside in the storm. The danger was right here, sitting at her table, quietly stealing her heart. The seventh day brought a silence so profound it made Emma's ears ring. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving Whisper Ridge buried beneath 3 feet of pristine, blinding white. The sky above was a sharp, aching blue, and the pine trees sagged under the weight of the ice. Emma was in the barn, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she pitched fresh hay for the milk cow. Silas was a few yards away, working a stiff leather strap through a broken bridle. He moved easier now, the fever having passed, though he still kept his left arm close to his ribs. Then the crunch of snowshoes broke the morning stillness. Silas didn't jump, but Emma saw the immediate terrifying shift in his posture. His right hand dropped the leather strap and hovered inches from where his gun should have been. His eyes locked onto the barn doors, cold and lethal. "Easy," Emma warned in a low voice, resting her pitchfork against the stall. If it was a posse, they wouldn't be making that much noise. She stepped out of the barn, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sun. Trudging up the ridge, a massive pack of furs strapped to his hunched back, was Elias. The old trapper looked more like a grizzly bear than a man, wrapped in thick buffalo hide and smelling distinctly of wet wool, chewing tobacco, and pine pitch. "Emmeline!" Elias called out, his voice like gravel grinding together. He unhooked his snowshoes and stomped onto the cleared porch. "See, the mountain didn't swallow you whole after all." "Takes more than a bit of snow, Elias," Emma said, a genuine smile breaking across her face. Elias was the closest thing to family she had left in the territory. "Come inside. The coffee is hot." Elias ducked into the cabin, dropping his heavy pack by the door. As he turned to warm his gnarled hands by the stove, he stopped dead. Silas had followed Emma inside, Caleb a silent shadow at his father's side. The old trapper's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Silas. He took in the faded flannel, the hard line of Silas's jaw, and the unmistakable dangerous stillness of the man. Elias had survived 60 winters in Indian territory and boom towns. He knew a killer when he saw one. "You didn't mention you took on a hired hand, Emma," Elias said slowly, his right hand resting casually near the hunting knife at his belt. "He's helping me patch the roof and chop wood to pay for board until the thaw," Emma replied smoothly, stepping between them to pour Elias a cup of coffee. "Silas Vance and his boy, Caleb. Silas, this is Elias. He runs the trap lines on the upper ridge." Silas gave a curt nod. "Obliged to meet you." Elias didn't return the nod. He took the tin cup from Emma, his eyes never leaving Silas. Caleb, sensing the tension, took a step back and grabbed a fistful of Emma's skirt. It was a small, instinctive gesture, but it didn't escape Elias's sharp gaze. The old man's eyebrows twitched upward, but he let the matter drop. "Brought you some flour and salt pork from the mercantile down in the valley," Elias said, turning his attention back to Emma. "Got there just before the pass snowed in. But I brought some news, too, and you ain't gonna like it." Emma's stomach tightened. She pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. "Spit it out, Elias." The old trapper took a slow sip of his coffee. "It's the bank, Emma. Old man Higgins finally showed his true colors. He's calling in the debts, all of 'em." "He can't," Emma said, her voice hard. "I spoke to Higgins in October. We agreed I had until the spring cattle drive to pay the interest on my father's note." "Higgins don't hold your note no more, girl," Elias said grimly. "He sold it, sold half the paper in the valley." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "Sold it to who?" "A cattle syndicate out of Texas," Elias spat, as if the words tasted foul. "Buying up all the water rights and choking out the small homesteaders. They got an army of lawyers and a payroll full of hired guns. Word is, as soon as the snow melts and the trails are clear, Their men are riding up here to foreclose. They want this ridge, Emma. I won't let them take my father's land, Emma said, her hands balling into fists on the table. I'll fight them. You can't shoot a piece of paper, Emmeline, Elias warned gently. And you can't fight an empire. They're called the Montgomery Syndicate. Crack. The sound was sharp as a gunshot. Emma and Elias both whipped their heads around. Silas was standing by the fireplace. He had been holding a piece of kindling in his right hand. He had gripped it so hard the thick wood had snapped cleanly in two. Silas's head was bowed, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but the knuckles of his hand were stark white. The temperature in the small cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. The quiet, hard-working drifter Emma had come to know over the last few days was gone. In his place stood something terrifyingly still and violent. "Vance?" Emma asked carefully. Silas didn't look at her. He tossed the broken pieces of wood into the fire, the flames briefly illuminating the cold, dead look in his gray eyes. "Just a knot in the wood, ma'am," he said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, which somehow made it worse. He turned on his heel and walked out the heavy oak door, stepping back into the freezing cold without his coat. Elias watched the door swing shut, then looked at Emma. "I don't know where you found that stray, Emma," the old man murmured, setting his coffee down. "But you'd better be careful. That man ain't just running from something. He's hunting something." That night, long after Elias had retired to the hayloft in the barn with a bottle of rye, Emma sat awake in the rocking chair by the hearth. Caleb was fast asleep in the bed. Silas was sitting on the floor by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. He had been out there in the freezing cold for an hour before coming back inside, carrying a tension so thick it was suffocating. Emma pulled her shawl tighter. She didn't mince words. "You know that name?" Silas didn't turn around. The moonlight painted half of his face in silver and shadows. "Montgomery," she pressed. "When Elias said it, you looked like you were ready to burn the world down." Silas remained silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire. Finally, he turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. There was a profound, weary sorrow in them that made Emma's breath catch. "Emma," he said softly, his voice rough, "you need to give me my gun back." Elias left at first light, his snowshoes carving fresh tracks down the mountain. Before he vanished into the timberline, the old trapper gave Emma a hard look, his breath frosting in the bitter air. "Keep your powder dry, Emmeline," he warned, adjusting the heavy fur pack on his shoulders. "And keep one eye on that stray you took in. He's carrying ghosts." Emma watched him go until he was swallowed by the white pines. When she turned back to the cabin, the rhythmic, punishing sound of the axe had already resumed. Silas was at the woodpile. He hadn't spoken a word since she refused to return his colt the night before. He just worked, his jaw set like granite, driving the maul into the pine logs with a violence that made the cold air snap. Emma left him to his demons and headed for the barn. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweet hay, manure, and old leather. Emma walked down the narrow aisle, checking the water troughs. When she reached the last stall, Silas's massive black gelding snorted, stamping a heavy hoof against the dirt. "Easy, boy," Emma murmured, reaching out to stroke the horse's velvet muzzle. She noticed a slight rub mark on the gelding's shoulder. The saddle had been sitting crooked on the partition wall since the night they arrived, the heavy leather saddlebags hanging haphazardly over the wood. Emma reached up to adjust the bags, intending to grab the tin of horse salve she knew Silas kept inside. The leather was stiff from the cold. As she pulled the saddlebag toward her, a worn brass buckle finally gave way. The flap fell open, and the contents spilled out, tumbling into the loose straw at her boots. It wasn't much. A spare flannel shirt, a tin of axle grease, a small whetstone, and a beautifully carved wooden horse, another toy for Caleb, and a piece of paper. It was folded neatly, but the paper itself was thick, cheap broadside stock, the kind tacked to the siding of every sheriff's office from Cheyenne to Abilene. Frowning, Emma knelt in the hay. She picked up the folded paper, brushing a piece of straw from it. She opened it. The bold black ink seemed to scream up at her from the page. Wanted dead or alive. Beneath the glaring letters was a charcoal sketch. The artist hadn't captured the weary sadness in his eyes, but the hard jaw, the scar through the left eyebrow, and the cold stare were unmistakable. It was Silas. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted down to the text beneath the portrait, and her blood ran to ice. Name, Silas Vance, formerly of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Crimes, murder in the first degree. Victim, Eleanor Montgomery Vance. Kidnapping of a minor, Caleb Vance. Reward, $5,000 in U.S. gold coin. Issued by Judge Harlan Davies, by order of the Montgomery Cattle Syndicate. Emma dropped the paper as if it had burned her fingers. Murder. She stared at the word. She had let a murderer into her home. She had let him sit at her table. She had watched him carve toys by the fire, had felt the rough, protective warmth of his hand when he caught the falling skillet. Eleanor Montgomery Vance. The name echoed in her mind, locking together with the news Elias had brought yesterday. The syndicate buying up the valley, the men coming to take her farm. They were the Montgomerys. Silas hadn't just killed a woman, he had killed a Montgomery. He had killed his own wife, and he had stolen the child. A sudden, terrifying thought seized her. Where is Caleb? Before the panic could fully take root, the heavy barn doors creaked open, letting in a blinding shaft of morning light. Footsteps crunched on the dirt floor, slow, heavy, deliberate. Emma didn't think. Survival instinct, drilled into her by a harsh father in a harsher land, took over. She lunged for her Winchester rifle, leaning against the stall gate. Silas rounded the corner, carrying an empty grain bucket. He stopped dead. Emma stood 10 feet away, her feet planted shoulder-width apart. The stock of the Winchester tucked tight against her shoulder. The hammer was pulled back with a sharp, metallic click. The barrel was aimed dead center at his chest. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands, nor did he reach for the empty holster at his hip. His gray eyes dropped from the black hole of the rifle barrel to the dirt between them. He saw the open saddlebag. He saw the wooden toy. And he saw the broadside, the bold word wanted stark against the yellow hay. The silence in the barn was absolute, save for the nervous shifting of the black gelding. "Where is the boy?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking with a cold, lethal fury she hadn't known she possessed. "In the cabin," Silas answered. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any panic or plea. "Reading the primer you gave him." "Did you kill her?" Emma's knuckles were white around the rifle's grip. The front sight wavered just a fraction of an inch, betraying the war raging in her chest. "Did you murder your wife, Vance?" Silas looked up slowly. The mask of the quiet, hard-working drifter was completely gone. The man standing before her now was the man on the poster, a hardened, dangerous killer cornered like a wolf. Yet there was no malice in his eyes as he looked at her, only a profound, crushing exhaustion. "If I say no," Silas said softly, the gravel in his voice thick with ghosts, "would you even believe me?" "You have 5 seconds to start talking," Emma warned, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Or the Montgomerys won't have to pay that bounty. I'll bury you on this ridge myself." Silas didn't move. He just stared down the barrel of her rifle, the silence stretching taut until it was ready to snap. "Go ahead and shoot, Emma," he finally whispered. "But if you do, you doom my son to a monster." The Winchester was heavy. It was a reliable, well-oiled machine of death, and Emma held it dead steady, the iron sights aligned perfectly with the center of Silas Vance's chest. 5 seconds passed. The silence in the barn was so deep Emma could hear the blood roaring in her own ears. "Talk," she commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Now." Silas didn't move toward her. He didn't flinch away. He just stood there, a man who had made peace with the end of a gun barrel a long time ago. He let out a slow, ragged breath that plumed in the freezing air. Eleanor was Harlan Montgomery's only daughter, Silas began, his voice barely rising above the rustle of the hay. I met her 5 years ago. I was working for the Pinkertons, hired to track down rustlers hitting the syndicate's herds. She wasn't like him. She was kind, soft. A bird locked in a gilded cage made of cattle money and blood. Emma's finger remained rigid on the trigger, but her eyes narrowed, searching his scarred, weary face for a lie. She found none. We fell in love, Silas continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Montgomery found out. He didn't just fire me. He had 5 of his men drag me out to the edge of the territory, beat me half to death, and told me if I ever looked at his daughter again, he'd hang me from a telegraph pole. But you went back, Emma guessed, her jaw tight. I went back, Silas confirmed, a ghost of a bitter smile touching his lips. We ran. We hid in a mining town up in Montana. We had 3 good years. We had Caleb. But you don't hide forever from a man who owns the judges and the marshals. They found us this past autumn. Silas looked away from the rifle barrel, his gaze fixing on the rough-hewn timber of the barn wall. The memories were dragging him under. I was out cutting timber. When I got back, the cabin was burned. Eleanor and Caleb were gone. Montgomery had taken them back to Texas. Silas's voice hardened, the gravel turning to crushed glass. I rode south. By the time I breached the gates of that estate, it was too late. Montgomery had locked her in her old room, punishing her. She caught a winter fever, and her heart just gave out. She died terrified, surrounded by guards. Emma felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She thought of Caleb, the silent, traumatized boy sitting by her hearth. Montgomery walked in while I was holding her body, Silas said softly. He needed someone to hang for her death, to keep his own name clean. And he needed Caleb. He told me he was going to strip the weakness out of the boy. Said he was going to use a whip and a branding iron to forge my son into a proper Montgomery heir. Silas finally looked back at Emma, his gray eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying fire. It was the look of a father who would slaughter the world to protect his blood. I didn't kill my wife, Emma. But I put a bullet in 2 of Montgomery's men to get my son out of that house. And I will kill 100 more before I let that monster touch my boy again. Emma stared at him. The wanted poster on the ground screamed murder, but the man standing before her bled truth. She remembered how gently Silas had whittled the wooden toy. She remembered the way he always placed Caleb's plate down before his own. A killer didn't look at a child the way Silas looked at Caleb. But a $5,000 bounty was a death sentence. It meant every hired gun, every desperate drifter, and every corrupt lawman in the West would be hunting them. And by sheltering them, she had painted a target on her own back. I should shoot you, Emma whispered, her voice wavering for the first time. If I don't, Montgomery's men won't just take my farm. They'll burn it to the ground with me inside. Then shoot me, Emma. Silas stepped forward, closing the distance until the muzzle of the Winchester pressed directly against his chest, right over his heart. He didn't blink. Pull the trigger. Claim the bounty. Pay off your farm. But I am begging you. Don't send the boy back to him. Emma's breath hitched. Her hands began to tremble. She had shot coyotes and rustlers, but she couldn't pull this trigger. She couldn't do it. Crunch. The sound of a small boot breaking the crusted snow outside the barn doors made them both freeze. The heavy door creaked open just a fraction. Caleb stood in the gap, shivering in his oversized wool coat. He had followed his father. The boy's wide, terrified blue eyes took in the scene. The dropped grain bucket, the wanted poster on the floor, and the rifle pressed against his father's chest. Silas's breath caught. Caleb, go back to the house, he ordered, his voice thick with panic. Don't look. But the boy didn't listen. Caleb stepped fully into the barn. He didn't run to his father. Instead, he walked straight toward the barrel of the gun. He stopped right beside Emma, his small hands reaching out to grip the rough denim of her skirt. Emma looked down. Caleb was staring up at her, tears welling in his bright eyes, spilling over his pale cheeks. Then his small chest heaved, and he opened his mouth. "Please." A tiny, raspy voice broke the silence. It sounded like a rusty hinge, a voice that hadn't been used in months. Don't hurt my pa. We'll be good." The rifle in Emma's hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The sound of the boy's voice, broken, desperate, and pleading for his father's life, shattered the last remnants of the iron wall Emma had built around her heart. She looked at the wanted poster, then at Silas, who was staring at his son with tears pooling in his own eyes, stunned by the sound of Caleb's voice. Emma slowly lowered the Winchester. The barrel pointed safely to the dirt. With a trembling hand, she reached the hammer and uncocked it with a soft click. She fell to her knees in the hay, dropping the rifle entirely, and pulled Caleb into her arms. The boy buried his face in her shoulder, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Emma wrapped her arms tightly around him, looking up at Silas over the boy's head. "Pick up your gear, Vance," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion but laced with a new, terrifying resolve. "If Montgomery's men are coming for this ridge, they're going to find out I don't give up what's mine." Silas stared at her, the tension draining from his shoulders, replaced by a profound, wordless gratitude. The pact of survival had just ended. The war had begun. The steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the cabin eaves wasn't the joyful sound of approaching spring. To Emma, it was the ticking of a hangman's clock. A warm Chinook wind had rolled over Whisper Ridge over the last 3 days. It gnawed at the snowpack, turning the pristine white drifts into gray slush and exposing jagged patches of dark, frozen mud. The valley below, obscured by blizzards for the past 2 months, was finally becoming visible through the skeletal branches of the pines. Inside the cabin, life had shifted into something dangerously close to a family. Ever since the day in the barn, Caleb had slowly emerged from his shell of silence. His voice was still quiet, used sparingly, but it was there, asking for a second biscuit, pointing out a hawk circling the ridge, or whispering goodnight to Emma. But as the snow melted, the quiet peace inside the cabin began to fracture. Emma watched Silas from the porch. He was standing by the corral, his forearms resting on the top rail, staring down the mountain trail. He had been out there for an hour, motionless. The tension that had left his shoulders weeks ago was back, pulling him taut like a wire about to snap. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and stepped off the porch. The mud sucked at her boots as she crossed the yard. When she reached the corral, Silas didn't look at her. His gray eyes were locked on the tree line below. "The pass will be clear by Sunday," Silas said, his voice a low, rough rumble over the wind. Emma swallowed the hard lump in her throat. "The mud will slow them down. A horse can sink to its knees on the lower switchbacks this time of year." "Montgomery's men won't care about mud, Emma," Silas replied, finally turning his head. The weariness in his face was devastating. "And they won't come knocking politely. They'll come with torches and rifles." He pushed off the fence and walked past her, heading straight for the barn. Emma's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She followed him, pulling the heavy door shut behind them, plunging the barn into a shadowed intimacy that smelled of damp earth and old leather. Silas was already at his stall, pulling his heavy saddle from the partition. "What are you doing?" Emma demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Packing," Silas said shortly, throwing the saddle blanket over the black gelding's back. "If I ride out tonight, I can cut east, draw them away from the ridge. They want me, Emma, not you." "They want this land," Emma shot back, stepping into his space and grabbing the heavy leather fender of the saddle to stop him. "Higgins sold my note to the syndicate. If you leave, they're still going to take this farm. You riding away doesn't save me, Silas. It just leaves me fighting them alone." Silas froze. He dropped his hands from the saddle, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy breath. When he turned to face her, the mask of the stoic drifter was completely shattered. "If I stay here," Silas grated out, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her, "they will kill you. Do you understand that? I have brought a firing squad to your front door. I won't let Caleb watch another woman he loves die because of me." The words "another woman he loves" hung in the damp air between them, heavy and raw. Emma stared up at him. She saw the terrifying depth of his fear, not for his own life, but for hers. She saw the calluses on his hands from chopping her wood, the scar on his shoulder from a bullet meant for his heart, and the desperate, burning light in his gray eyes. "You don't get to make that choice for me," Emma whispered fiercely, refusing to back down. "This is my home. I decide who I fight for." Silas groaned, a sound of pure, agonizing defeat. Before Emma could take a breath, his hands came up, framing her face. His calloused thumbs traced her cheekbones, rough and trembling. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing left in a world falling apart. Then he kissed her. It wasn't a soft, tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of chicory coffee, cold air, and impending doom. Emma's hands instinctively flew to the lapels of his flannel shirt, gripping the fabric tight as she kissed him back with equal ferocity. She anchored him to her, pouring every ounce of the unspoken terror and longing of the past 2 months into the space between them. Silas's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. For a fleeting, breathless moment, the world outside the barn ceased to exist. There was no bounty, no syndicate, no snowmelt. Just the heat of him, the steady, frantic beat of his heart against hers. When they finally broke apart, both of them were gasping for air. Silas didn't let her go. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut, his chest heaving. "Emma," he breathed, the name an anchor and a prayer. She kept her hands flat against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him. "Don't leave us, Silas. We stand our ground. Together." Silas slowly opened his eyes, looking down at her with a heartbreaking clarity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the iron key to her cedar chest, the key she had given him weeks ago to fetch a blanket. He pressed the key into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "I'll stay," he promised softly, though his eyes were dark with a terrible resolve. "I'll fight them beside you. But if we lose the ridge, if they corner you—" He stepped back, his hands dropping from her waist. The cold air rushed back in between them. "You open that chest, you give them the Colt, and you give them the wanted poster," Silas commanded, his voice hardening back into steel. "You tell Montgomery's men that I held you hostage. You tell them you were waiting for the thaw to turn me in for the reward money. You use my bounty to pay off your father's land." Emma stared at him, horrified. "I would never—" "Swear it to me, Emma." Silas grabbed her shoulders, giving her a slight shake, his eyes blazing. "Swear to me that if I fall, you will use my blood to save yourself and Caleb. It is the only way I can stay." Tears pricked Emma's eyes, but she blinked them back, lifting her chin to meet his fierce gaze. She saw the unyielding stubbornness in him, the ultimate sacrifice he was willing to make. "I swear it," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. Silas let out a breath and nodded once, stepping back to finish saddling his horse. But as Emma walked out of the barn and back into the blinding glare of the melting snow, she made a silent vow of her own. She wasn't going to turn him in. She was going to load every weapon in the cabin, and she was going to send Montgomery's men straight to hell. The fire had burned down to white ash, leaving the cabin steeped in a bone-deep, creeping chill. Emma woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She lay still in the pre-dawn gray, straining to hear the familiar sounds that had become her lifeline over the past weeks, the soft, even breathing of the boy, the heavy, restless pacing of the man. There was nothing, only the hollow dripping of melting snow off the eaves. Throwing off her quilts, Emma swung her bare feet onto the freezing floorboards. "Vance," she called out, her voice thick with sleep and rising panic. She walked into the main room. Caleb's pallet near the stove was empty, the blankets neatly folded. Silas's canvas duster was gone from the peg by the door. "Silas!" The silence screamed back at her. Emma rushed to the heavy oak door and wrenched it open. The biting morning air hit her face. The yard was a mess of mud and slush, and leading away from the porch down the ridge was a set of deep, heavy boot tracks. Alongside them were the smaller, lighter prints of a child. There were no hoof prints. Confusion warring with dread, Emma turned back into the cabin. That was when she saw it. Sitting dead center on the scarred wooden kitchen table, caught in a pale shaft of morning light, were two pieces of paper held down by a single, heavy point, .45 caliber bullet. Emma approached the table slowly, her hands trembling as she picked up the first document. It was thick, official parchment. She recognized the wax seal of the Territorial Bank, but scrawled violently across the front in fresh dark ink were the words, "Paid and settled in full. J. Vance for the Montgomery Syndicate." Beneath the signature was the deed to her father's land. It was hers, free and clear. Emma dropped the deed and snatched up the second piece of paper. The handwriting was sharp, rushed, and unmistakable. "Emma, the thaw brought their advance man to the lower switchback last night. He was holding your note, waiting for the mud to clear so they could ride up and take the ridge. I paid him a visit in the dark. I didn't have the cash. But a syndicate man knows the value of prime horseflesh. I traded him the black gelding, Caleb's pony, and the last of my Pinkerton gold. The debt is wiped. The land is yours. I broke my promise to stay, but I couldn't let them take your home. We're heading east on foot. Without the horses, we're slow, and Montgomery's men will track us easy. They'll follow my trail and leave you be. Keep the fire burning, Emma. And don't follow. Silas." Emma stared at the paper, the words blurring as tears finally spilled over her lashes. He traded the horses. In the brutal expanse of the West, a wanted man without a horse was a dead man walking. By giving up the black gelding and the gold, Silas had deliberately cut off his only means of escape. He had sacrificed his freedom, his mobility, and ultimately his life, to buy a piece of dirt for a woman he had known for less than a month. He had turned himself into bait to draw the wolves away from her door. "You stubborn, noble fool," Emma whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. She crumpled the letter in her fist, falling into the wooden chair. For 2 years, she had fought to survive on this mountain. She had endured hunger, freezing storms, and the crushing weight of loneliness. She had begged the banker, patched her clothes, and swallowed her pride. And Silas had fixed it all in a single night, leaving her safe and completely, utterly alone. But as the tears hit the wooden table, the despair inside Emma suddenly hardened. It crystallized into a white-hot, furious resolve. Silas thought she was a woman who needed to be saved. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. Emma stood up, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. She marched to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She didn't open it to surrender the wanted poster. She opened it to retrieve the heavy leather gun belt Silas had left behind. She strapped the Colt single-action army low across her hips, the familiar weight of the iron grounding her. She grabbed 2 boxes of ammunition, her hunting knife, and her Winchester .73, shoving extra shells into the pockets of her heavy canvas coat. She ran to the barn. The 2 empty stalls mocked her, but in the third stood her own mount, a sturdy, mean-tempered mountain mare that lacked the speed of Silas's gelding, but possessed twice the endurance in deep mud. Emma threw the saddle on the mare, pulling the cinch tight with a vicious yank. "He said don't follow," Emma muttered to the horse, sliding the Winchester into the saddle scabbard. "But he doesn't give the orders on this ridge." She swung into the saddle and spurred the mare out of the barn. The morning sun was cresting the peaks, turning the melting snow to blinding gold. Emma looked down the mountain, her hazel eyes flinty and lethal. If Montgomery's men thought they were just hunting a tired man and a little boy, they were about to learn a very painful lesson about the woman from Whisper Ridge. Emma kicked the mare into a hard trot down the muddy trail, riding straight into the teeth of the danger Silas had tried to spare her from. Halfway down the first switchback, the crisp mountain air was shattered by a sound that made Emma's blood run cold. Crack! The sharp, distant echo of a rifle shot rolling up from the valley below. The second gunshot echoed before the first had fully died away, rolling up the canyon walls like thunder. Emma didn't hesitate. She dug her heels into the mare's flanks, sending the horse plunging down the steep, treacherous switchbacks. Mud flew in thick, wet clods, and the freezing wind tore at her braid. But Emma kept her eyes fixed on the tree line below. As she neared the base of Whisper Ridge, the smell of burning powder cut through the scent of wet pine. Emma pulled hard on the reins, sliding the sweating mare to a halt behind a massive outcropping of gray granite. She swung down from the saddle, drawing her Winchester .73 from the scabbard. Keeping low, she scrambled up the slippery scree to the top of the rock face, peering over the jagged edge into the gorge below. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a box canyon, choked with fallen timber and melting snow. Pinned down behind the massive, rotting trunk of a fallen spruce was Silas. He had Caleb tucked tightly beneath him, shielding the boy's body with his own. Silas was holding a rusted Schofield revolver, likely lifted from the advance man he'd traded with the night before, but he was completely pinned. 50 yards away, spreading out in a tactical half-circle, were 5 men. They wore heavy canvas dusters and carried repeating rifles. Montgomery's men. They were seasoned, ruthless, and they were advancing methodically, using the boulders for cover. "Save your lead, Vance," one of the men shouted, his voice echoing off the stone. He stepped out from behind a boulder, a silver marshal's star pinned mockingly to his lapel. "You've got 3 bullets left, maybe 4. We want the boy alive, but the old man didn't say what condition we had to bring you back in." Silas didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the Schofield, his body coiled tight like a spring. He was waiting for them to rush, preparing to sell his life for a few more seconds of time for his son. Emma felt a cold, deadly calm wash over her. She was vastly outnumbered, but she had the high ground, the element of surprise, and a rifle she had fired 1,000 times since she was 12 years old. She nestled the stock of the Winchester against her shoulder, resting the heavy barrel on the granite ledge. She ignored the pounding of her heart and focused on the front sight. She lined it up squarely with the chest of the man with the silver star, the one barking orders. Emma let out half a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The valley erupted. The leader jerked backward as if kicked by a mule, his rifle clattering to the stones as he fell hard into the slush. Chaos instantly fractured the syndicate's line. "Sniper on the ridge!" one of the men screamed, diving behind a stump. Before they could track the smoke from her barrel, Emma levered another round into the chamber and fired again. The bullet smashed into the dirt inches from a second man's boot, sending him scrambling backward in pure panic. Down in the gorge, Silas's head snapped up. He recognized the sharp, unmistakable crack of Emma's Winchester. Even from a distance, Emma could see the fury and terror flash across his face. Terror that she had put herself in the crossfire. But Silas Vance was a professional. He didn't waste the distraction. He lunged up over the fallen spruce, firing twice. One of the syndicate men cried out and dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder. Suddenly, a deafening boom echoed from the opposite side of the canyon, sounding like a cannon going off. A heavy .50 caliber lead ball shattered the boulder, hiding the third syndicate man, showering him in lethal rock shrapnel. Emma looked up. High on the eastern ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun, was a massive figure wrapped in buffalo hide. Elias. The old trapper had heard the gunfire and brought his buffalo rifle to the fight. "Crossfire!" the remaining syndicate men yelled. Their discipline evaporated. They were cattle enforcers used to intimidating unarmed farmers, not fighting a coordinated ambush in a frozen gorge. The 2 uninjured men broke and ran for their horses tied near the tree line. Emma didn't shoot them in the back, but she didn't let them leave with their courage intact either. She shifted her aim high, targeting a massive ice-choked overhang of snow and dead branches perched directly above the horses. She fired 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy bullets shattered the ice holding the debris in place. With a deep, groaning rumble, the overhang gave way. A miniature avalanche of heavy, wet snow, rocks, and timber crashed down directly between the fleeing men and their horses. The terrified animals snapped their tethers and bolted blindly down the valley. The syndicate men were left floundering waist-deep in the freezing slush, weaponless and stranded on foot. They threw their hands in the air, screaming for quarter. The gunfire ceased. The sudden silence in the canyon was deafening, broken only by the ringing in Emma's ears and the heavy drip of melting snow. Emma lowered her rifle. Her hands were shaking violently now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. She engaged the safety, slid the Winchester back into her shoulder sling, and began the treacherous climb down the scree slope into the gorge. By the time her boots hit the muddy floor of the canyon, Elias was already making his way down from the opposite side, his massive rifle resting casually over his shoulder. Emma ran toward the fallen spruce. Silas was leaning against the rotting timber, his chest heaving. He had dropped the empty show field. Caleb was clinging to his father's leg, pale and wide-eyed, but completely unharmed. When Silas saw Emma, he pushed himself off the log. His face was smeared with mud and gunpowder, and his gray eyes were ablaze with a terrifying mixture of anger, relief, and awe. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "I told you," Silas roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I told you not to follow me!" Emma didn't back down. She stepped right up to him, tilting her chin up to meet his furious gaze. "And I told you," Emma shot back, her voice equally fierce, though tears of relief were spilling down her cheeks, "that you don't give the orders on my ridge, Silas Vance. I fight for what's mine." Silas stared down at her, the anger completely draining out of him, leaving nothing but absolute surrender. He reached out, wrapping his large, trembling hands around her face, and pulled her hard against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in, as if she were oxygen. Emma wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, burying her face against his canvas coat, the smell of cordite and cold air filling her senses. "You crazy, magnificent woman," Silas whispered roughly against her hair. Below them, a small pair of arms wrapped around both of their legs. Caleb squeezed himself into the embrace, burying his face in Emma's heavy skirt. Elias reached the bottom of the gorge, taking a slow look at the groaning, surrendered syndicate men and the small family clinging to each other in the mud. The old trapper spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow and chuckled. "Well, Vance," Elias rumbled, a rare, genuine smile cracking his weathered face. "Looks like you finally found somebody who shoots as straight as you do." The 3 surviving syndicate men were tied back to back around a thick stump, shivering in the freezing slush of the canyon floor. Elias stood over them, his massive buffalo rifle resting lazily in the crook of his arm. While Emma kept her Winchester trained on the prisoners, Silas knelt beside the man with the silver star, the one Emma had dropped with her first shot. He wasn't dead, but his shoulder was shattered and the fight had completely bled out of him. Silas reached into the inside pocket of the man's heavy duster and pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. He flipped through the water-stained pages, his gray eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. Slowly, the tension that had gripped Silas's jaw for the past 3 years began to ease. He let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. "What is it?" Emma asked, stepping closer, her boots sinking into the mud. "It's Montgomery's payroll," Silas said, looking up at her, a fierce light kindling in his eyes. "And his bribery logs. Federal judges, territorial marshals, land office clerks. It's all in here. Dates, amounts, names." Elias spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow and grinned, exposing a row of crooked teeth. "Well now, I reckon the Pinkertons down in Denver would pay a handsome sum for a book like that. Enough to make a certain fraudulent bounty disappear altogether." Silas looked down at the ledger, his thumb tracing the worn leather edge. For the first time since he had taken Caleb and run into the night, the invisible noose around his neck went slack. Montgomery wouldn't be hunting them anymore. The cattle baron would be too busy running from the federal government to worry about a runaway son-in-law. "Take the book, Elias," Silas said, tossing the ledger to the old trapper. "Turn it in. Collect whatever reward the feds are offering. Consider it payment for the crossfire." Elias caught the book seamlessly. "I'll ride down to the marshal's office in Cheyenne once the mud clears." "And what about these three?" he asked, nodding to the shivering prisoners. "Leave them their boots and point them south," Emma stated, her voice brooking no argument. "It's a long walk to Texas. If they survive the mud, they'll carry the message back. Whisper Ridge is taken." By the time they climbed back up the mountain to the cabin, the sun was high, and the eaves were dripping heavily with the promise of spring. The snow was finally surrendering to the dark, rich earth beneath. Emma unlatched the heavy oak door and let them inside. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin was still warm. Caleb immediately ran to the hearth, wrapping himself in Emma's quilt, his small face exhausted but peaceful. Silas stood in the doorway, hesitating. He had traded his horses. He had traded his gold. He was a man with nothing left to his name but a rusted Schofield revolver he had taken off a hired gun and the mud on his boots. Emma walked over to the cedar chest. She picked up the territorial deed Silas had left on the table that morning. The deed stamped "paid in full." She turned and faced him. "You bought my land, Silas Vance." Silas took off his hat, his fingers nervously tracing the brim. "I just paid a debt, Emma. You saved my boy's life. You saved mine. It was the least I could do." "And now you have nothing," she said softly, stepping closer to him. Silas looked down at her, the intense, piercing gray of his eyes stripping away every defense she had left. "I have my son," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "And I have my freedom. That's more wealth than I've known in a long time." "Then what are you going to do now?" Emma asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The bounty will be gone. The snow is melting. The trail is open." Silas didn't answer immediately. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently taking hers. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, tracing the rough skin earned by years of solitary survival. "I'm a man without a horse, Emma," Silas murmured, the ghost of a smile finally touching his lips. "I can't go far, and truth be told, I've done enough running for one lifetime. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Not as a hired hand paying off a debt, but as your partner. If you'll let me build something here, with you." Emma looked up into his weary, beautiful face, the iron wall around her heart, cracked by a silent boy and shattered by a stubborn cowboy, finally crumbled to dust. She didn't answer with words. She stepped up on her toes, wrapped her arms around his neck, and pulled him down into a kiss that tasted of tears, relief, and the sweet, undeniable promise of home. Silas wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor, holding her as if he would never let her go. And for the first time in 2 years, Emma Hayes wasn't fighting alone. 1 year later, the wind didn't just blow over Whisper Ridge. It screamed, hurling thick white waves of snow against the cabin walls. The winter had returned, fierce and unforgiving. But inside the cabin, the storm was nothing but a lullaby. The small, drafty shack Emma's father had built was gone. In its place was a sturdy, expanded log home, its joints tight and its hearth wide. A heavy iron pot of stew simmered over the roaring fire, filling the room with the scent of venison and wild rosemary. Sitting at the scarred wooden table, Caleb was carefully drawing on a slate board. He had grown 3 inches, his cheeks full and rosy. He was humming a low, off-key tune to himself. Emma sat in the rocking chair by the fire. Resting against her chest, swaddled in the very same quilt that had once warmed Caleb, was a sleeping infant girl with a tuft of dark hair. Silas was by the window, adding a thick pine log to the woodbox. He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, the tension completely gone from his shoulders. The scars remained, but the ghosts had finally been laid to rest. Suddenly, over the roar of the blizzard, a sharp sound cut through the cabin. Thump, thump, thump. 3 heavy knocks at the front door. Instinct, honed by years of violence, flared instantly. Silas dropped the wood. In a blur of motion, his hand dropped to the custom Colt single-action army strapped to his hip. His gray eyes went deadly cold as he positioned himself between the door and his family. Emma didn't reach for her rifle. Instead, a warm, knowing smile spread across her face. She gently shifted the sleeping baby in her arms and reached out, placing her hand softly over Silas's tense arm. "Easy, cowboy," Emma whispered, her eyes dancing with amusement. "You don't need the iron." Silas blinked, the lethal edge in his posture breaking. He looked at Emma, then slowly pulled his hand away from the gun. Caleb jumped up from the table, a bright, eager grin on his face. "I'll get it," the boy shouted, his voice clear and full of life. Caleb threw open the heavy oak door. The wind burst inside in a flurry of white, but the figure standing on the porch wasn't a bounty hunter or a ghost from the past. It was Elias. The old trapper was covered head to toe in snow, his beard frozen solid, but he was holding up a massive, freshly plucked wild turkey by the legs. "Hope I ain't late for supper," Elias bellowed over the storm, stepping inside and kicking the snow off his boots. "Mountain nearly swallowed me whole." "Uncle Elias," Caleb cheered, throwing his arms around the massive frozen man's waist. Silas let out a deep, rumbling laugh, stepping forward to help Elias with his heavy coat, while Emma rocked the baby, watching her boys by the door. The Wyoming wind howled outside, beating against the thick logs in a futile rage. But Emma just pulled her daughter closer, surrounded by the noise, the warmth, and the laughter. She had once asked the mountain for nothing but survival. But the storm had brought her a weary cowboy and a silent boy, and somewhere in the frozen dirt, they had planted the deepest roots of all.